All right, so let's get started. In the first lecture, it was just a lot of review, kind of a lot of setup, and then a little bit of macro history. Sort of starting with the lecture here and the sort of remainder of the lectures for today, that being day two, we're going to sort of be a little bit more on task and sort of moving through material a little bit more quicker with a little bit less discussion than we had in that first lecture, sort of getting down to the nitty gritty, so to speak. And then when we get to Thursdays and Fridays, day 4 and 5, we'll start layering in a little bit more of that discussion as we start filtering all this back into the neoclassical model. Now, one of the more important conversations, it sort of goes without saying when we talk about macroeconomics, is the concept of consumption. Now, the reason why we are going to do a little bit of micro theory, so-called micro foundations, is because later on, when we actually are talking about our macroeconomic models, we're going to use the word consumption. We're going to use the word savings. We're going to use the word investment. We're going to use the word lend. And at the end of the day, if we just kind of stay with the macro models, what we end up saying is basically you have optimizing agents, consumers are making decisions, and then the outcomes are sort of the macro economy. We want to have a clearer idea as to what sort of consumption actually looks like in these economic models. Because later on, when we talk about, for example, say, interest rate policy coming from a central bank, we want to have a good idea in our minds about what that policy is likely going to do to the behavior of economic agents, whether those are consumers or even if those are producers who, in a sense, when they make their products, are also consuming things as well. And so that's what we're going to do here a little bit. So I'm actually going to skip the social welfare stuff for now. We're going to bring that back in on the third day, third or fourth day. Okay, so what explains consumption? How do economists think about consumption? Well, the term that we use essentially to explain consumption is utility. Basically, the idea is that consumers consume, buy things in order to satisfy their utility function. The utility function represents happiness, prosperity. It's a bit nebulous, a little bit ambiguous, and certainly abstract. One of the weaknesses, in fact, of microeconomic theory is the reliance upon utility functions, because utility ends up being such an abstract idea. So what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of set up the idea of utility maximization kind of in a very basic general sense. And then we're going to use that idea and talk about the idea of intertemporal utility, which is essentially thinking about consumption decisions, not just in terms of the current time period, but thinking about consumption decisions over multiple time periods. And ultimately, we're going to have a fairly simple dynamic savings model where we essentially consider the younger part of your life and the older part of your life. And then the sort of question is, how are consumers going to behave over the course of their life with sort of policy changes and changes to things like interest rates and incomes and so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to do here. So utility functions are nice in economics because they are very flexible. We can say that consumers consume according to their utility function. That just means that there are things that we enjoy. In this particular scenario, I say things like slices of pizza, cans of soda. But you can really think about utility functions as sort of capturing everything that we do, all the sort of behaviors that we do that are trying to generate benefit for us. So investment, buying a house, buying a car, putting money in the bank to save for a rainy day, or putting money into your 401k. All of these are in service to what we're going to think about as a maximization, or more broadly, an optimization process, that consumers are optimizing when they make their economic decisions. And then this gives us a clearer understanding, if we believe that story at least, this gives us a clearer understanding of how then individual behaviors sort of add up to the macroeconomic aggregate. So there's always sort of simple ideas aside these relatively complicated ideas in economics. So in terms of utility, we have the classic diminishing returns idea. The first slice of pizza tastes better than the second one. First cup of coffee tastes better than the second one, so on and so forth. It's a very common experience for people to have, and in the context of a macroeconomic policy conversation, one of the things that economists might do is we might use the idea of diminishing returns basically as some justification for something like progressive taxation. So if we give an individual an additional dollar, from a societal perspective, how are we going to benefit the most? If we give a dollar to a relatively wealthy person, or if we give a dollar to a relatively unwealthy person. And so the idea would be that since the unwealthy person has less money, giving them an additional dollar will most likely generate a higher change in utility. We'll get more utility change by giving the low income individual that dollar than if instead we gave the high income individual that dollar. Now, there's always, of course, debates and different philosophies kind of along this particular line. For example, some people might argue that, okay, yeah, just from a utility perspective, it probably is true that society generates more happiness in the short term by giving the additional dollar to the low income individual. But maybe the argument is that the rich person, is able to invest that money and it generates gains for the economy that ultimately will benefit the low income individual. In a way, this sort of gets twisted into conversations about so-called trickle down economics and so on and so forth. But that is a debate and a sort of philosophical conversation that we can have. Progressive taxation, and again, we can kind of rely upon basic economic principles to sort of have that conversation. It doesn't really even need to get that political as an example. So that's why one of the reasons I like talking about utility is because it kind of removes, it makes things a little bit more scientific, I guess, if you will. Now, economics would be very boring if we were not constrained in our ability to maximize our utility. And so utility maximization, the optimization process that consumers undertake is one that we refer to as constrained optimization. In particular, you are constrained by your income. The amount of money that you have constrains your ability to consume. And again, because we're going to ultimately be thinking about these things over someone's lifetime, the idea here would be is that you're going to earn a certain amount of money over your lifetime that will constrain your ability to consume during your lifetime, which again, I think is a pretty straightforward idea. The math gets a little complicated, as we'll see here in just a moment, but the idea is pretty straightforward. So a budget constraint. So what a budget constraint does is it basically creates for us what we refer to as a choice set. And so the idea of a choice set is that my income gives me access to available bundles. Bundles are you can imagine that a bundle is an amount of the two goods in question. Okay. By the way, we're only really ever going to worry about two goods in this context. And the reason why that is, I just spilled a little bit of coffee on myself. The reason why we're only going to consider two goods is because it keeps us in two dimensions. If we wanted to consider a three-good utility function, we would have to add a third dimension, and things get a lot more complicated in that. So two goods. All right. So the idea here is that we're simplifying the concept of consumption, and we're imagining a world in which the consumer has access to two potential goods. They can spend their income on those two goods, and they're going to buy bundles. They're going to buy an amount of one of the good and an amount of the other good. Now, that could be zero. It could be such that, optimal decision implies that the person consumes all of one good and none of the other. Although we'll talk in a moment about how, some of the assumptions we make in terms of utility theory preclude maybe some of those more extreme bundles. And so generally speaking, we can think that consumers are buying combinations of the two goods in question. Here in the simple graphical representation we see here, we have goods X and Y. So we have a good X and a good Y, and they can be anything. I mean, it could even be like going for a walk, because you're spending time. So maybe time becomes part of your budget here. We're going to keep things simple. We're going to keep it just in terms of money. And so your income is, of course, going to mostly the way that we're going to think about it is that it's going to come from labor. So you expend labor and you get a wage from that. In fact, when we talk about how much of your labor you're willing to, in a sense, offer up to the market, we think that's also a utility maximization problem. So there's this concept called the labor-leisure trade-off. And so the idea is that relative to your own utility function, relative to the wage rate, you're going to be willing to work a certain number of hours. And so as your wage rate declines, you're going to be willing to work fewer hours. And like say, as your preference for working increases, in other words, if you like what you do, you're going to be more willing to work, so on and so forth. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, the idea of utility is abstract in the sense that the number produced by an actual utility function doesn't really mean much to us beyond that it gives us a point of comparison. So ultimately, when we talk about the choice set, you have bundles that you can consume, but our idea is going to be that there's only one bundle that you want to consume, right? And so what you have to do is you have to find that optimal bundle. So when we talk about utility maximization, that's the concept, right? We're going to purchase the bundle that maximizes our utility. And then, of course, we cannot consume bundles that we cannot afford. And so the budget constraint, again, creates that constrained concept in terms of optimization. Now, of course, one of the things that we're going to be very interested in and certainly interested in the conversation about intertemporal utility is the idea that things change. So you'll often hear economists say that budget constraints represent opportunity cost in between the two goods in question. In other words, if we're thinking about how much of good X I need to give up in order to increase my consumption of good Y, the slope of the budget constraint is going to dictate that. So in other words, if I move from, say, this bundle to this bundle, you can see that it requires, right, that I give up an amount of X in order to get an amount of Y. That's the classic definition of opportunity cost. If I want to increase my consumption of Y, I have to decrease my consumption of X. And here what we see is that in particular, the price of good X increases. And so the budget constraint pivots in, and now you can see that the choice set is smaller than it was before. Again, this may seem overly simplistic, but for example, when we start talking about the impact of inflation on consumer decisions, we have a very simple argument to make, which is basically that inflation is, broadly speaking, going to make the choice set available to consumers smaller. And you can imagine that if the choice set available to consumers is smaller due to inflation, then the individual is also less likely to be as happy as they would have been prior to inflation. Even if there's some substitution that the individual is able to do and they can avoid some of the inflation, they're still changing their behavior in response to the inflationary pressure. And that's where economists are really interested. We're interested in the behavioral response to something like a price change, or here on the right, a behavioral response to something like an income change. So what happens when people's incomes change, and what do we think that's going to mean for consumption? Okay, and again, the idea here is that we want to be able to work towards a definition of consumption so that later on, when we talk about interest rate policy, we talk about tax policy, we have an idea of how consumers are likely to react to that, not just in the short run, but also over the very, very long run. Okay, so one of the things that you'll hear me kind of talk about, and I think I've already talked about it a little bit in economics, is this concern over the mathiness, how mathy is economics. There's a really good article. I'm not going to require it for this class because it's not sort of that important for this class, but it's useful in the sense that Paul Romer, who's one of the most important economists of the 20th and 21st centuries, who basically says that the mathiness of economics has reduced its usefulness. That math is important, but in a sense, we've gone too far. The mathiness has gone too far, which I think is a salient point, and I certainly am, let's say, sympathetic to that argument. At the same time, I also very much agree with this particular individual. Let me just make sure that I'm sharing my sound here. There we go. All right.
Functions describe the world. Everything is described by functions. The sound of my voice on your eardrum, function. The light that's kind of hitting your eyeballs right now, function. The entries you put in your random matrices, function. It's all function. Different classes in mathematics, different areas in mathematics study different kinds of function. High school math studies second degree one variable polynomials. Calculus studies smooth one variable functions. And it goes on and on. Functions describe the world. Function.
You just gotta love the energy. So I sort of agree with both. I agree with Paul that economics can be too mathy, and I also agree with that individual that at the end of the day, though, it's not untrue for us to basically argue that everything is a function, and so attempting to describe things in terms of functions is very useful, but we do have to be a little bit careful. And so I think part of the conversation here is going to be, okay, let's do some mathiness, and then let's maybe say what we're going to take from it and maybe what we're not going to worry so much about. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of bundles for a moment. And now what we're going to do is we're going to label bundles X, Y, and Z. These are just bundles of goods. And so bundle X, bundle Y, and bundle Z. And then we're going to have these preference relations. So if I say X and this sort of funny looking greater than sign, I say X is preferred to Y. In this case, strictly preferred. There's no qualifier. Here we can see there's a qualifier. We say X here is at least as good as Y. I can't say X is better than Y necessarily, but I can say X is at least as good as Y. And then maybe I'm indifferent between X and Y. So X and Y are the same for me. And so we're going to think about these things in terms of utility levels. And so if I strictly prefer X to Y, I know that the utility level of X and Y are different. So if we assume for a moment that X and Y are the same price, and I also say that I strictly prefer X to Y, it must be the case that X provides higher utility than Y does, right? If we see X is at least as good as Y, X might produce more utility than Y, but it produces at least as much utility as Y. And then if X is indifferent to Y, then we can think about them as producing the same amount of utility. Again, that is assuming the prices are the same. If the prices of the bundles are different, they become harder to directly compare because for example, you might buy a good and I might see you buy that good and I might see that you would have bought something else, or could have bought something else. I don't know necessarily whether you prefer the one you actually bought, because it could be a price differential that sort of forced that particular sort of idea. But if we say that the bundles are the same price and I see you buy one over the other, it gives me a pretty good idea. We call that revealed preference in economics. You reveal your preferences to me. So if bundle X is the same price as bundle Y, and I see you buy bundle X, then I feel pretty good that X generates higher utility for you than bundle Y does. We have some axioms in microtheory that are particularly important. The completeness axiom just says that we can actually compare bundles to each other, which is important for us. So the idea is that we're comparing apples to apples, and we're not comparing or trying to compare apples to oranges. The second axiom, the reflexive axiom, just means that we are indifferent between the same bundle. So bundle X is indifferent to bundle X. That's more of a mathematical principle. If we didn't assume that, we would sort of allow for some very funky looking utility functions. And so assuming that makes our utility functions a little bit simpler. And then lastly, we assume a transitive property, which is that if X is at least as good as Y and Y is at least as good as X, Z, then we're going to say X is at least as good as Z. So the preferences are transitive. A preferred to B preferred to C, therefore A is preferred to C. Because we preferred A to B and B to C, we prefer A to C as well. So that's the idea of transitive. Now, we make these assumptions and we state these particular assumptions because they sort of represent the governing principles of consumers. So when we talk about consumption, we're talking about it in the context of these sort of governing principles. So utility functions have these characteristics, and if they have these characteristics, then we feel that the models do a pretty good job of explaining how people actually do consume. Remember, economics is not a prescriptive discipline. We're not trying to tell you how to behave. We're telling you how you actually behave. That's the idea. Okay. Now, graphically, we want to be able to represent levels of utility. And so what we came up with in order to do that is the so-called indifference curve. And so an indifference curve is just a curve that represents a utility level, and then all of the bundles along that curve generate the same level of utility. So, for example, here on this indifference curve 1, we can see bundles A and B both fall on that indifference line. So bundle A and bundle B generate the same level of utility for me, therefore I'm indifferent between them. On the other hand, we can see that bundle C exists on a higher indifference curve, therefore represents a higher level of utility. And so we could say that I prefer bundle C to either bundles A or B. The idea here is just that indifference curve gives us a visual representation of utility. And then later on, we're going to combine indifference curves with budget constraints to get a visual representation of utility maximization. That's sort of what we're working towards. Indifference curves can accommodate lots of different preferences. For example, if the two goods in question are perfect complements, then the indifference curves look like this to the left. Notice that the idea of perfect complements is that if I have two goods that are perfect complements, if I get one more unit of only one of them, I don't get any happier because I only am able to consume units having both of them at the same time because they're perfect complements. Think right shoe, left shoe. Think computer monitor. They're sort of useless without the other. And so I can get, for example, a lot more computer monitors, but if I only have one computer, doesn't necessarily mean much to me, or vice versa, right? And maybe that's a bad example because I'm sitting here looking at multiple monitors, but the right shoe, left shoe, I think is a really good example here. And then we also can have perfect substitutes. The perfect substitutes comes up in the context of intertemporal utility, because very often we might assume that consumers don't have any particular value over current consumption relative to future consumption. And other times we'll say they do have a preference over those two things. It actually becomes a fairly important idea in terms of lifetime consumption. do consumers prefer consumption today, or do they prefer consumption in the future? Different people are going to have different preferences, right? Just like different people in this context are going to have different preferences towards good X1 and X2, right? We're all going to have different utility functions likely at the end of the day. That means that our preferences over things like Coke and Pepsi, hot dogs and steak are going to be unique person to person, but also therefore our preferences as it pertains to spending and saving over our lifetimes is also going to be preference-based as well. That's kind of the big idea here, is that we're taking this idea of utility maximization and then eventually we're going to sort of point it towards a macro economic question. So for us, well-behaved preferences, quote unquote, well-behaved preferences produce convex indifference curves. Well-behaved preferences are preferences that have all of these particular axioms. The other nice thing about well-behaved preferences is they also have diminishing returns, which again is one of those characteristics that we tend to expect from utility functions. Okay. And then lastly, to sort of wrap up this video before we actually get into utility maximization, let's talk real quickly about marginal utility. So the idea of marginal utility, let's see, I think I might, nope, I have it here. No, I don't. Okay. So the idea of marginal utility is that as I consume an additional unit of one good, my utility is going to change as a result of that additional consumption. And so that increase in utility, we're going to refer to as marginal utility. So how much does my utility change relative to an increase in my consumption of one good or another? And so let's just give you an example here. So here's sort of just the representation of marginal utility. So marginal utility of X is just going to be the change in utility divided by the change in X. So if I increase my consumption of X by 1 unit, how much does my utility change? If I can change my consumption of Y by 1 unit, how much does my utility change? Again, this brings back that idea of diminishing marginal returns. The idea here is that ultimately the marginal utility is what ends up governing our consumption decisions, that we make decisions based upon our marginal utility. How much is our utility going to change if we, switch up our consumption? And then this is where you get this idea of thinking on the margin. Now, this is important for a couple different reasons. It's important because this is sort of how we think about microeconomics. And the other reason why this is important is because the reason we think about this utility and consumption this way is that this is the way we've been thinking about it for a very, very long time. So this idea of marginal utility, this idea of thinking about individual consumer decision making, this comes from the so-called marginal revolution during what you might refer to as the neoclassical revolution, it kind of in the tail end of the 1800s into the end of the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about Alfred Marshall, we're talking about William Jevons, Vilfredo Pareto. These will all be names that you hear throughout the semester. Alfred Marshall, for example, famously is one of the first people to come up with the idea for supply and demand. And so in this era, we start sort of, instead of thinking about economics just as this macro idea, we start thinking about economics in a much more micro setting. This, again, as I said, is referred to as the marginal revolution, because instead of thinking about economics just in terms of macroeconomy, we're now thinking about economics in terms of individual decision making. And so this is where the idea of utility maximization comes from. I, as a consumer, consume based upon the goal of maximizing my utility. That's going to be the governing principle that we believe, in a sense, defines consumer behavior. And so, again, what this is going to ultimately do is give us a model to think about how things like interest rate changes, income changes, those things that are going to change in the concert of the macroeconomy, how are those things going to change someone's actual behavior. And ultimately our belief is that people's behavior is governed by, in this case for consumption, the process of utility maximization. That is, consumers are seeking out optimal bundles in terms of goods and services consumption. And then again, also we're going to think about this in terms of savings, spending, and consumption over a lifetime. So in the next video, I'm actually going to take you through a couple examples of actual utility maximization. So you'll see that process. And then we'll move on to intertemporal budgets here very quickly. So see you in the next video.